The handshake lasted exactly 3 seconds. But those 3 seconds destroyed a career that had taken 30 years to build. George Stevens, the Academy Award-winning director of Giant and Shane, extended his hand to Dean Martin in the marble lobby of the Beverly Hills Hotel on March 17, 1968. What Stevens didn't know was that Dean Martin had just delivered a death sentence disguised as a pleasantry. What Stevens couldn't have imagined was that the King of Cool possessed enough invisible power to end a Hollywood legend's career without raising his voice, without making a single phone call, without anyone even knowing it had happened until it was far too late. The confrontation had been building for months. George Stevens was old Hollywood royalty, a man who had directed some of the greatest films ever made. He was serious, intellectual, and deeply contemptuous of what he saw as the degradation of American cinema. To Stevens, entertainment was becoming too casual, too commercial, too focused on personalities rather than artistry, and at the center of this cultural decline, in Stevens' mind, stood Dean Martin. The morning air in Beverly Hills carried the scent of jasmine and ambition. Inside the hotel's Crystal Room, the Hollywood Foreign Press Association was hosting their annual pre-Oscar luncheon. The room buzzed with the carefully modulated conversations of industry titans, their voices creating a symphony of power and privilege. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in cream-colored linen, where studio heads sat next to foreign correspondents, and legendary directors shared dessert with rising stars. Dean Martin entered at exactly 12:30, fashionably late, but not disrespectfully so. He wore a charcoal gray suit that had been tailored in Rome, a silver tie that caught the light just right, and the kind of casual confidence that could only come from knowing you belonged anywhere you chose to be. Conversations paused as he made his way through the room. Not because he demanded attention, but because he commanded it simply by existing. George Stevens watched this entrance with barely concealed disgust. Stevens was seated at table 7, surrounded by fellow directors who shared his reverence for cinema as an art form. Billy Wilder was there, along with William Wyler and George Cukor. These were men who had crafted cinematic masterpieces, who understood that movies could be literature, could be poetry, could change the world. And then there was Dean Martin, who treated entertainment like a casual Friday afternoon. "Look at him," Stevens muttered to Wilder, "walking around like he owns the place. The man's never made a serious film in his life. He's a lounge singer who stumbled into movies." Billy Wilder, always the diplomat, tried to deflect. "Come on, George. Dean's made some decent pictures. Rio Bravo was solid entertainment." "Entertainment," Stevens spat, as if the word tasted bitter. "That's exactly the problem. Everything's just entertainment now. Where's the artistic integrity? Where's the commitment to elevating the medium?" Stevens had been nursing this resentment for years. He'd watched as the industry increasingly valued stars over stories, personalities over performances, commercial appeal over artistic vision. And Dean Martin represented everything Stevens despised about this trend. Here was a man who seemed to sleepwalk through his roles, who treated acting like a hobby, who made millions by simply being charming. It was an affront to everyone who took the craft seriously. The tension reached its breaking point when Dean approached Stevens' table during the cocktail portion of the event. Dean had been making his rounds, greeting old friends and industry colleagues with his characteristic warmth. He'd shared a laugh with Cary Grant, complimented Audrey Hepburn's dress, and told a self-deprecating joke that had David Lean chuckling. It was vintage Dean Martin, effortlessly social, genuinely likable, completely unpretentious. "George," Dean said, extending his hand as he reached Stevens' table. "Good to see you." Stevens looked at the offered hand for a long moment before reluctantly shaking it. His grip was firm, almost aggressive, and he held it a beat longer than necessary. "Martin," he said coldly. "How's the new picture coming along?" Dean asked, genuinely interested. Stevens was preparing to direct The Only Game in Town, a drama starring Elizabeth Taylor and Warren Beatty. This innocent question was the lit match that set off Stevens' explosion. The director's face darkened, his jaw tightened, and 20 years of accumulated frustration came pouring out in a voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "You want to know how my picture's coming along?" Stevens said, standing up to match Dean's height. It's coming along like every serious film these days, fighting for scraps while the studios throw money at whatever lightweight nonsense will sell popcorn to teenagers. The room began to quiet. Conversations at nearby tables slowed as industry veterans sensed the approaching storm. Dean remained perfectly calm, his expression unchanged, but those who knew him well could see the almost imperceptible shift in his posture. The easy smile remained, but something cold had entered his eyes. "I don't understand what you mean, George," Dean said quietly. "Of course you don't understand," Stevens continued, his voice rising. "Understanding requires thought, requires depth, requires caring about something more than your next paycheck. You wouldn't know artistic integrity if it walked up and slapped you in your perfectly tanned face." The insult hit the room like a physical blow. Even Billy Wilder, no stranger to Hollywood feuds, looked uncomfortable. George Cukor actually winced. This wasn't professional disagreement. This was personal assassination. Dean took a slow breath, and when he spoke, his voice was so quiet that people leaned forward to hear him. "George, I think there might be some confusion here. I'm just an entertainer. I try to do my job well, treat people with respect, and go home to my family. If that bothers you, that's your business, but don't mistake your problems for mine." Stevens laughed bitterly. "Entertainer? That's rich. You're not an entertainer, Martin. You're a symptom. You're everything that's wrong with this industry. You represent the death of cinema as art, and its rebirth as commerce. You're a lounge singer who fell into movie stardom by accident, and you've never once tried to earn what was handed to you." The silence that followed was suffocating. Every person in that room understood they were witnessing something significant, something that would be talked about for years. Dean Martin had just been publicly humiliated by one of Hollywood's most respected directors, accused of being a fraud, a dilettante, a man who had never earned his success. Dean's response was devastating in its simplicity. He smiled. That trademark, sleepy Dean Martin smile that had charmed millions of fans around the world. Then he reached out his hand again. "You know what, George?" Dean said, his voice warm and friendly. "You're entitled to your opinion. I respect that. I truly hope your next picture is everything you want it to be." Stevens, confused by Dean's reaction, automatically shook the offered hand. "Good luck with your next picture, George." And then Dean Martin walked away. He didn't storm off, didn't throw a drink, didn't fire back with his own insults. He simply shook George Stevens' hand, wished him luck, and continued his rounds as if nothing had happened. Within 5 minutes, he was laughing with Jack Lemmon about golf. Within 10 minutes, he was deep in conversation with Kirk Douglas about their upcoming collaboration. George Stevens stood there watching Dean's retreat, feeling simultaneously victorious and confused. He'd expected anger, defensiveness, perhaps even a public shouting match. Instead, he'd gotten grace under pressure, which somehow made him look petty and small by comparison. What Stevens didn't realize was that Dean Martin had just set something in motion that would systematically destroy everything Stevens had worked for. The handshake wasn't surrender. It was a declaration of war. And Dean Martin didn't fight wars with armies or weapons. He fought them with influence, with loyalty, with the kind of quiet power that moved mountains without anyone noticing until they were already buried. The machinery of Dean's revenge began turning immediately, though it was so subtle that even its targets didn't recognize it at first. Dean never made angry phone calls or demanded boycotts. He never spoke negatively about Stevens to anyone. Instead, he did something far more devastating. He stopped recommending him. In Hollywood, careers lived and died on recommendations. When studio executives needed a director for a prestigious project, they didn't just look at credits and awards. They asked other successful people who they thought would be right for the job. And Dean Martin, despite Stevens' dismissive attitude, was one of the most successful people in the entertainment industry. His opinion carried enormous weight. When Warner Brothers approached Dean about who should direct his next dramatic role, Dean mentioned William Wyler. When Paramount asked for his thoughts on directors for a big-budget war film, Dean suggested John Huston. When every studio in town was looking for someone to helm their prestige pictures, Dean had recommendations for everyone except George Stevens. It was more than just omission. It was strategic placement of other names. Dean began quietly promoting directors he respected. Men like Howard Hawks, John Ford, and Robert Aldrich. He spoke glowingly of their professionalism, their vision, their ability to bring out the best in their actors. He became an unofficial advocate for a generation of filmmakers who understood that entertainment and art weren't mutually exclusive. Meanwhile, George Stevens found himself increasingly isolated. Phone calls from studio executives became less frequent. Lunch invitations dried up. Scripts that should have come to him first started showing up on other directors' desks. The entertainment industry is built on relationships, and Dean Martin's vast network of relationships had quietly closed itself off to Stevens. The most devastating blow came 6 months later, when The Only Game in Town was released to disastrous reviews and catastrophic box office numbers. The film that was supposed to be Stevens' triumphant return to relevance instead became evidence that he was out of touch with contemporary audiences. Critics called it outdated, pretentious, and painfully slow. Audiences stayed away in droves. What Stevens never realized was that Dean Martin hadn't sabotaged the film directly. He hadn't needed to. By removing himself from Stevens' professional orbit, by quietly redirecting the industry's attention elsewhere, he had created a vacuum around the director that nobody was willing to fill. When you're fighting for resources in Hollywood, having powerful enemies is bad. Having powerful people ignore you completely is death. The final nail in Stevens' coffin came when he approached Dean directly, swallowing his pride to ask for help. It was Christmas Eve 1969, and Stevens was down to his last few $1,000s. His phone wasn't ringing. His agent had dropped him. His house was in foreclosure. In desperation, he showed up at Dean's Beverly Hills home. Dean answered the door himself, wearing a cardigan sweater and holding a cup of coffee. He looked genuinely surprised to see Stevens standing on his doorstep. "George," Dean said warmly, "come in. It's cold out there." They sat in Dean's living room, surrounded by family photographs and gold records, the detritus of a successful life. Stevens looked around at the evidence of Dean's prosperity and felt his own failures weighing on him like physical chains. "I need to ask you for something," Stevens said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's that?" "I need you to make a phone call for me. To Jack Warner maybe, or Daryl Zanuck, just to let them know I'm still available, still interested in working. I know we had our differences, but—" Dean held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "George," Dean said gently, "I think you misunderstood what happened between us. This isn't about our differences. This isn't about forgiveness or second chances. You told me exactly what you think of me, of my work, of my place in this industry. And you know what? You're probably right about some of it. I'm not Orson Welles or John Ford. I'm just a guy who sings and acts and tries to entertain people." Stevens started to interrupt, but Dean continued. "The thing is, George, this industry runs on relationships. It runs on trust. It runs on people believing that you'll treat them with respect. And that night at the Foreign Press Luncheon, you showed everyone in that room exactly how you treat people when you think they're beneath you. You didn't just attack me, George. You attacked the idea that different kinds of talent can coexist. You declared war on anyone who doesn't meet your definition of artistic purity." Dean stood up and walked to the window, looking out at his pool, his garden, his perfect slice of the American dream. "I never made any phone calls against you," Dean said. "I never said a bad word about you to anyone. I didn't have to. You did all the damage yourself. What I did was much simpler. I stopped including you in conversations about the future of filmmaking. And in this town, if people stop talking about you, you cease to exist." Stevens sat in stunned silence, finally understanding the magnitude of what had been done to him. It wasn't revenge, it was consequences. Dean Martin hadn't destroyed his career. Stevens had destroyed it himself by burning bridges he didn't realize he would need. "So no," Dean said, turning back to face his former adversary. "I won't be making any phone calls. Not because I'm angry, but because I don't believe you've learned anything from what's happened to you. And until you do, you'll just make the same mistakes again." George Stevens left Dean's house that night and never worked in Hollywood again. He spent his remaining years teaching film at USC, bitter and forgotten, warning young filmmakers about the importance of politics and relationships in an industry he felt had betrayed him. He died in 1975, convinced that Hollywood had lost its soul to commercial interests, never understanding that his downfall had nothing to do with artistic integrity and everything to do with basic human decency. Dean Martin continued making movies for another decade, working with many of the directors he had quietly championed during Stevens' exile. He never spoke publicly about what had happened, never took credit for Stevens' downfall, never even acknowledged that there had been a feud. To Dean, it had simply been a matter of choosing who deserved his support and who didn't. The handshake that ended George Stevens' career lasted 3 seconds, but its effects rippled through Hollywood for years, serving as a quiet reminder that in an industry built on collaboration, arrogance was the most expensive luxury anyone could afford. Dean Martin had proved that you didn't need to scream to be heard, didn't need to attack to defend yourself, didn't need to destroy your enemies when you could simply let them destroy themselves. In the end, Stevens had been right about one thing. Dean Martin was just a lounge singer who had stumbled into movie stardom. But what Stevens had failed to understand was that stumbling into something and mastering it were two entirely different things. Dean Martin had spent 30 years learning how Hollywood really worked, how power really flowed, how careers were really made and broken. And when George Stevens chose to test that knowledge, he discovered that the man he'd dismissed as a lightweight was actually one of the heaviest hitters in town. The handshake was just good manners. Everything else was pure professional devastation, delivered with a smile.